So this is how Microsoft learned to love Java. My name is Reza Rahman. I'm a Principal Program Manager for Java and Azure at Microsoft. More or less, this talk is about my day job and all of the different ways that Microsoft is supporting Java developers these days. I'll tell you, to be honest with you, if you had asked me 5 to 8 years ago that I would be doing this talk, I would tell you no way. So it's really remarkable that I'm delivering this talk. And frankly, it's even more remarkable the work that Microsoft is doing in the Java community. I definitely think it's, even if you don't wind up using some of these things that we're doing at Microsoft, it is definitely encouraging for you to at least know about it, at least know about what's going on and precisely what is the work that Microsoft is putting out these days. So before I get started, I will try to stay basically on time. It's going to be a packed agenda. I have quite a bit of content to go through. I don't necessarily need to go through all of it. I think I'd much rather have you guys interact with me and comprehend the material rather than focusing on, covering X amount of slides. So here's what I would like to do. Don't hold back questions until very late in the presentation. I will try to save some time to do that. I'll try to save about 10 minutes. It's a 50-minute presentation, so I'll try to finish in about 40 and then save about 10 for us to chat specifically during a Q&A time. But that shouldn't mean that you should stop asking questions. In fact, I would encourage you to not hold back those questions. There will be natural pauses while I present, and I will stop and check. And if you want, you can come off mute and simply ask your question. You could even turn on your video if you prefer. I really don't mind. But in the bare minimum, you can definitely type something into the chat. I will check the chat intermittently, just like I'm doing here, and basically answer your questions as we go along, instead of waiting until the very end. Okay, so I don't have much of my contact information up on this slide. I'm relatively easy to reach, both via email and Twitter and LinkedIn and so on. At the end of the presentation, I'll share a link with all of my contact information. You can definitely reach out to me in any way that you want. One of the points of doing these talks at conferences is not just to deliver the material, but also to connect with you on a one-on-one basis. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, I think for most of us, it's obvious what is affecting this particular change in Microsoft. But in order to crystallize that, I think you can definitely take a look at some data. You can take a look at any number of data. There's a lot of data available on this. You can take a look at some of the studies that various analysis firms put out. You can take a look at jobs data, or you can also take a look at some of these indexes. The best known one would be the TOB programming index. And as you can see, this is looking at a broad spectrum overview of what is going on in the programming language landscape for about 20 years, a pretty long time horizon. And this is to the credit of the Java ecosystem as to really how dominant things have been over such a long period of about 20 years. And things do not look to be changing much now. Some smart aleck, when I present this graph, they say, oh, look, Java is going down. So I would like you to, okay, that's fine. But I would like you to think about this a little bit deeper and observe this graph and intersect this graph with business cycles. And what you'll find is that the predominant languages, namely C and Java, are actually more susceptible to business cycles than the other programming languages. So you'll see these dips, and these dips basically coincide with business cycles. And I believe what's happening, the current dip in 2020 is more than anything else. It's again, these dominant languages being subjected more and more affected by business cycles. And as you can see, it's already bouncing up. My suspicion is in a year or two, we'll see the overall long-term trends staying the way they are. Now, as we all also know, while C is definitely, it is to C's credit that it has been as successful as it has been. C in general is a systems, is effectively the de facto standard for systems programming, more or less. So if you're really definitely talking about the enterprise space, where a lot of Microsoft business is these days, particularly on the Azure platform, it is obvious which programming language should be taken seriously. And that is, frankly, one of the primary drivers of why we are doing all this work and we are trying to win effectively hearts and minds in the Java ecosystem by doing everything that we can on your behalf in as many way and shape or forms as we can. Okay, so how old is this Java on Azure or Microsoft Java at Microsoft? In truth, I think we all know things didn't always used to be this way. This was a cultural part of a broader cultural change at Microsoft. I think we all know the transition with Satya and Nadella and the change in direction from, in particular, to be more focused on Azure. It's very clear where our focus is these days. So Java on Azure, I would say, is at this point is about 5 or 6 years old. In fact, this is the talk that I'm giving you right now. It's part of a long tradition. I believe this talk was first delivered sometime around 2016, if I'm not mistaken, 2016, 2015, something along those lines. So it's been actually a few years that one person or the other at Microsoft delivers some rendition of this talk as well. Okay, so first, I think it's fairly obvious that the heart and soul of what we're doing today is centered on Azure. And it's not limited to Azure, as we'll see in a moment, but a lot of it is actually centered on Azure. And what we want to make sure is that Java developers are definitely empowered to move to Azure and be able to use everything that Azure offers in the most effective way possible. Now at Microsoft, we realize that Java is a diverse ecosystem. There's no one solution for all. There's many people that are for legitimate reasons using one technology stack or the other. So whether you're using just Java SE, whether you're using some variant of Java E, Jakarta E, or microprofile, or whether you're using the Spring ecosystem, we want to make sure that all of those stacks are well supported in Azure. Just because you're moving to Azure should not mean that you need to change the direction that you have been going with your technology choices. So as we know, by and large, for all clouds, more or less, there are various pathways where you move into the cloud. There's virtual machines, there's containers, there's managed services, and of course, there's serverless. So I think of this as sort of a broad map of the next about 15 minutes or so that I'll be talking about this particular topic. It's a roadmap of that particular section. And as you'll see in a moment, for each of these variants, Microsoft has relatively strong offerings that intersect with technology stacks, particular product flavors, and the type of destination that you're going to land on Azure. And we'll see this in depth in a moment. Similarly, I think like all clouds, we're not particularly opinionated about what type of architecture you should be using. There's plenty of people moving monolithic applications just as is, or I would like to say cohesive applications as is onto the Azure platform. There's some combination of containerizing those monoliths. There's a set of applications where it's some mix of monolithic applications and microservices. Maybe even some of those microservices are not new, but been extracted from the monolith in some way or the other. And of course, we also have so-called cloud native applications that are all microservices. Typically, serverless is a good example of architectures of that kind. So again, your architecture, your technology choice, your framework, whatever it is, bring it to Azure. We make sure that all of those pathways are clear on your behalf. Okay, so let's start with virtual machines. This is I think, believe it or not, on Azure, it still continues to be the most popular pathway to move to the cloud. This may not be very sexy, but it's definitely reliable, right? And a lot of people still using it, and probably a majority of our revenue on Azure still does come from virtual machines. So this is more or less, to use a cliche, it's your computer on Microsoft's cloud, more or less. It's the experience is similar to what you would have on premise, but there are some distinct differences. We'll talk about those differences in a moment. In particular, the biggest difference is something called Azure Marketplace solutions. So even when you are using virtual machines, it's an old, reliable technology. The experience of you setting things up on those virtual machines can be automated and can be made a lot nicer. It doesn't have to be that you always have to start with the bare minimum operating system and do whatever you would do on, without automations in place. That's not the case. That's the purpose of the Azure Marketplace and the Azure Marketplace solutions, is to make that initial setup step, the boilerplate stuff, go away, and the experience to be a lot more smoother. Now, the key to doing all of this, in fact, the key to the kingdom in terms of getting Java on Azure started is the fact that we are no longer just a Windows virtual environment based platform. Really, all flavors of Linux, are available on Azure. In fact, the most popular one is typically Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Unless I'm mistaken, I think we're just about to actually cross the threshold where we have more Linux VMs and we have Windows VMs on Azure. So that tells you a little bit about where the momentum is. And again, that's a reflection of the data that we looked at earlier, the TOB programming index. It's not a big surprise, as Azure is a mainstream platform, cloud platform. It reflects what the data is and what the reality is in the broader ecosystem as well. So looking at the Azure Marketplace portfolio, we actually have these, again, usability solution templates, pretty much covering all spectrums of Java. So you have flavors of Java SE. I hope soon we'll talk about this in a moment. We have our own Open JDK. Hopefully we get to have that as a Marketplace solution portfolio offering as well. We have good coverage for Jakarta EE and variants runtime. So we have Tomcat, JBoss AP, WebLogic, WebSphere, so on. We have all kinds of solution templates for data solutions as well. We have PaaS offerings that I'll talk to you in a little bit about. That's of the most popular databases. But you also can run things like Hadoop or what have you as well. Oracle database is one of the ones that we do not actually support as a PaaS offering, but there is a solution template, or at least a marketplace offer that will allow you to create even an Oracle database on Azure relatively easily. Same thing for messaging platforms. Azure has its own messaging solutions. In fact, they have those messaging solutions have Java bindings. Azure Service Bus is one of the key ones of those, but other than that, pretty much all of the Java ecosystem messaging platforms are also reflected in the Azure Marketplace, as are DevOps options as well. So Jenkins, there's a nice template for Jenkins. It's actually relatively popular. There's also solutions for Elastic, and we even have actually an Elastic PaaS. Elastic company has an offering that allows you to run Elastic services on Azure as a PaaS platform. And we also have solution templates for Splunk for a lot of customers that actually do wind up using Splunk. Okay. So I think these days our analysis our coverage of what we are doing for Java developers wouldn't be too complete if we didn't talk about multi-cloud platforms. They are increasingly popular. I would say they're not yet as popular as some of the other options just yet. And we'll talk about things like AKS in a moment. They are reasonably popular. So the examples of this would be Azure Red Hat OpenShift, as well as VMware Tanzu. So we do ensure that these things are supported well on Azure. There are use cases for it. So these are good for if you're, for example, have hybrid deployments. So you have some deployments on your own data centers, some deployments on Azure or some other cloud, or you're using multiple clouds. Basically, what these multi-cloud platforms allow you to do is at least have your user experience be exactly the same across these multiple different clouds. So there's definitely good reasons to consider these things. So on Azure, we have a fully managed version of Red Hat OpenShift. It's called Azure Red Hat OpenShift, in fact. So what this allows you to do is very easily set up Azure Red Hat OpenShift. It's basically a PaaS. So yeah, it cuts down on a lot of the boilerplate tasks and day-to-day management tasks of running OpenShift. We don't have a PaaS solution per se for VMware Tanzu. There is a Spring Cloud service. We'll talk about that, and there's some tie-ins with VMware Tanzu there. But you can also, you do have a marketplace solution template to get Tanzu up and running on its own if that's what you prefer to do. Okay. Containers are the elephant in the room. Really, this is probably the fastest growing ways of moving to the cloud, certainly on Azure. And in fact, in terms of even the industry, if you take a look at some of the trend graphs, Kubernetes is taking off like gangbusters. So Azure provides support for containerization in a very robust way. In fact, we have one of the most robust Kubernetes offerings out there. It's called the Azure Kubernetes Service. And this is basically a PaaS, a Kubernetes PaaS. It's as easy, literally point and click, and you have your Kubernetes service up and running. It's just as easy as that. We also have a couple other different variants to go along with the Azure Kubernetes service. We also have an Azure Container Registry. This is useful if particularly in a large environment, or large corporate environment where you want those images to be secured and within your own firewalls in Azure. That's where an Azure Container Registry comes in very, very handy. And we also have an interesting option, actually a couple of interesting options that allow you to use containers, but not necessarily use Kubernetes, but just use Docker and do deployments in a very simple way. This is useful, for example, if you don't really need a full-scale orchestration and self-healing capabilities and all the other capabilities that Kubernetes has, and it's a relatively simple application. You just want to Dockerize it a little bit and deploy it and create a few instances of it. There's a couple of different ways you can do that. There's Azure Container Instances, and there's also App Service for Container. That's yet another choice for you to do precisely that, is to have more of a containerized experience without going full-blown Kubernetes. And in fact, there may be other options that'll be coming your way that are very similar to this as well. It's the idea of using containerization without necessarily needing to use Kubernetes, or at least not being exposed at a very low level to Kubernetes necessarily. So what we do here in terms of containers is similar to what we're doing for the Azure Marketplace for virtual machines. At the bare minimum, we have step-by-step guidance that's validated with given vendors to make sure that their runtimes actually works well with things like the Azure Kubernetes service. So, for example, we do that for WebLogic with Oracle. We do that for OpenLiberty and Western Liberty, for Azure Kubernetes service with IBM and so on. And we are looking to very soon actually have similar to solution templates in the marketplace that instead of targeting VMs, they're actually targeting the Azure Kubernetes service in some case, or even in some case, the ARO, if that's what you prefer. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a little bit. Managed services is sort of a big topic on its own to cover. Probably if somebody asked me, hey, what is so special about Azure? Other than the fact that we're very large, we have probably the largest largest number of data centers. We're a very secure cloud, and so on and so forth. One of the main reasons from a programmer standpoint is actually our PaaS offerings or managed services offerings. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about that. But in the meanwhile, I've been talking for a little while. Like I said, I did a basic, I told you at a high level what we offer in Azure, why we're doing some of this work. So let me pause a little bit and see if you have any questions. And again, feel free to just come off mute and ask me a question or post it on the chat, whatever you prefer. Any questions? All right, I'm going to assume no. Don't be shy. Do feel free to post just about anytime you want. So managed services. The crux from a programmer standpoint in terms of managed services runtimes on Azure is something called the Azure App Service. And basically what the Azure App Service does is that it takes away most of the boilerplate work to run your application runtimes on Azure. And in terms of Java, it really has very good coverage. So in terms of App Service, we have managed Java SC. So you just point and click, and you have an instance, or however many instances, load balanced instances of Java SE, manage Java SE running. You can run Tomcat the same way, and also you can run JBoss EAP the same way as well. So this is Java SE developers, Tomcat, more or less Spring framework developers. Java SE developers are also, you can deploy Spring Boot applications that way. Whereas for Java EE developers, we're offering managed version of JBoss EAP on App Service. Now, aside from running your runtime, actually most of the infrastructure that we have, infrastructure pieces that we have on Azure are all available in managed services variants. In fact, what we find is while most people, there's some question whether your application runtime ultimately should run on as a PaaS or on Kubernetes or on virtual machines. It's almost always reasonably obvious why you would want to run infrastructure pieces like databases and directory servers and so on as PaaS services instead. So these are hugely popular. I would say perhaps even more popular than App Service. Even if somebody is not using App Service and they're just using virtual machines or Kubernetes, they're still using a managed database and so on and so forth. So we have a number of these. Some of these are basically just the Java specific portions we talked about. The rest of these are best of breed software, and that is essentially offered up as managed services. So examples with this would be SQL Server. We call it Azure SQL. We have Azure Database for PostgreSQL, Azure Database for MySQL, and so on. All of the more popular databases. Really, the only one that we don't offer as a managed service is Oracle DB, but that's about it. All of the rest of the major databases we offer as PaaS services. Cosmos DB is an interesting one. So this is basically a multi interface NoSQL solution. So basically, once you run Cosmos DB, you can access it through a MongoDB interface or a Cassandra interface, or even a graph database using the Gremlin standard or specification. And that's basically our NoSQL solution. Aside from that, we also have managed Redis. Okay, so you could get Redis up and running very easily. And not have to manage it, not have to go through the deployment steps and so on. Similarly, App Insights is sort of the Microsoft native solution that's equivalent for ELK. Okay, similarly, GitHub Actions is sort of our analog of Jenkins. And in fact, you may argue that GitHub Actions is taking up, it has quite a bit of traction these days, and definitely GitHub Actions is very much aligned with Azure. We more or less are basically, since we own GitHub, it makes a lot of sense for you to using GitHub as your repo manager and Azure as your cloud and GitHub Actions as your CI/CD pipeline mechanism. We talked about the messaging services. So there's a number of these on Azure. There's Azure Service Bus, Event Hub, Event Grid. We also have Active Directory, hugely popular directory server implementation, even outside the cloud. Key Vault, which is essentially using secure storage, key value storage for the cloud. Blob storage, if you're doing large binary objects or simply large files, you can think of this as sort of as your file system on the cloud. Although we do have another solution called Azure Files that provides a Samba interface. As well as a Windows interface to store files as in a file system as opposed to storage. So for each of these things, typically there is at the bare minimum a Java SE binding of some kind. So for databases, that's an obvious one. It's JDBC. But each of these things like Azure Service Bus or Event Grid or Event Hub or App Insights, they have their own flavors of Java SE based APIs. Often they will also have Spring starters or Spring bindings, Spring Boot starters or Spring Boot bindings in many cases. And where possible, there is also, where it makes sense, there's also Java EE bindings. So a good example of that, for example, is Service Bus. Service Bus provides support for the JMS standard, so you can access Service Bus using JMS. For example, you can use, I have a good example out there that allows you to, you can see it's very easy to use Azure Cosmos DB with something like Jakarta NoSQL, for example. So definitely the Java EE integrations are also possible and very, very easy to do. Okay, now our newest service offering. If you noticed in the previous one in App Service, there's nothing specific in terms of Spring support. There's a specific support for Java EE in terms of JBoss AP, and then Tomcat users and Java SC users. So Azure Spring Cloud is sort of, if you will, the ultimate service that we offer for Spring developers. So what this is that it allows you to very easily deploy your Spring Boot-based microservices in terms of deploying a jar file that has Spring Boot embedded in it. But above and beyond that, it actually has Spring Cloud specific services as well. So once you deploy your Spring Boot applications into this environment, you can also take advantage of circuit breakers, service registries, API gateways, configuration, distributed tracing, and the like. And these are all just available to you. They're already running in the Azure Spring Cloud environment. You can simply consume them as you wish and mix and match them as you need them. And of course, aside from that, you can still access all of the rest of the Azure services as well, whether that be a database or message broker or what have you. All of that is still available. So it's a really nice managed environment for Spring Boot applications. It's sort of one-stop shop, if you will. There will be some tie-ins with Tanzu very soon with this as well. So this is where you have more of your Tanzu integrations rather than necessarily just running Tanzu on its own on Azure. Okay, so serverless, you definitely cannot complete a talk on anything that has to do with the cloud without talking about serverless. Serverless is reasonably popular. It's not as popular as containers per se, but it is reasonably popular, at least on Azure. And I suspect even beyond Azure, it's the same story. And basically, the serverless answer on Azure is something called Azure Functions. So Azure Functions does have bindings for Java. You can write Java Azure Functions directly in the Java language. Of course, you can deploy more serverless friendly runtimes within that, right? So you can deploy Quarkus applications, for example, or Hilton or Micronaut applications within Azure Functions. But the function itself and its bindings can be written in Java as well. In fact, in some simple cases, you may not need a framework. It may be just good enough for you to write these Java functions on Azure. There's also logic apps. Long and short explanation of it, if you're not familiar with the concept, is that it's sort of ESBs for serverless. So it allows for all different kinds of integrations with Azure services in a declarative manner, as opposed to doing that in a programmatic fashion in an Azure function. Okay, so I'm going to stop and pause. That is about it in terms of Azure. But there is a lot more that we are doing for Java developers, even if you're not you don't happen to be using Azure. We'll talk about that in the next 10 minutes or so. But before I do that, I'm going to pause and take any questions that you might have so far. Again, feel free to post in the chat, just come off mute, whatever you prefer. Okay. All right. I hope I am holding your interest. No questions can mean two things. One is that I'm doing a very good job of explaining things, which seems unlikely, or I hope I haven't lost your attention. So do feel free to post questions. You don't have to post some questions right now. As I said, I'll leave my contact information. If you have questions later, you can definitely get in touch with me a bit later also. We are here to engage with you and help you. So one of the more interesting things that has happened in recent years is something that, if you're familiar with the history of Java and Microsoft, it was pretty rocky in the very beginning, and some of us still remember the lawsuits and things like Visual J++ and the like. So I am very happy about the fact that we now have a compatible implementation of OpenJDK. It doesn't do any kind of proprietary extensions and the like. Our express reason is to provide a rock-solid implementation, a standard-based compatible implementation of OpenJDK, and also to contribute to the OpenJDK project. We've been doing that here and there. I think as time goes along, we'll be doing more of this. But in the meanwhile, you have what we hope is actually a very solid implementation of OpenJDK. It's a LTS distributions. It's a completely free, and it is supported. If you're running on Azure, certainly it is supported, and but either way, it's once you download these distributions, they will be around for a long while. We'll continue to do maintenance releases of them. That right now it is supported on Mac, Linux, and Windows. We're doing some work on in terms of ARM early access as well, if you're interested in that. So right now it does only support Java SE 11 and above. We are sort of thinking about how we can support Java SE 8 if there's demand for that. All of this, this OpenJDK is actually baked into Azure itself. So it used to be that Azure was the JDK we used to use for things like, for example, Azure Functions or App Service. So we are basically incorporating the OpenJDK into Azure itself. Now, you might be wondering, okay, so is this something that just came out of thin air? It's really not. Believe it or not, Microsoft has had a large footprint of Java for a little while. And the reason for this, if you think about it, is reasonably obvious. So we own LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is a very, very large Java deployment. So in fact, LinkedIn has a connection with this OpenJDK distribution, and in fact, even things like Minecraft. Those are all essentially Java footprints within Microsoft that most people don't think about, but they are there. So this is actually possible thanks to Eclipse Adoptium. I think as things go along, we'll be more and more involved with Eclipse Adoptium, and perhaps with the JCP as well, in addition to what we're doing in the OpenJDK project in terms of some of our contributions. So feel free to give it download it and give it a try and see what you think of MS-JDK, or rather MS distribution of OpenJDK. All right, so anything Microsoft would not be complete if we didn't talk about tooling. Tooling has been a strong suite, for Microsoft for actually a very long time. It's sort of built into the culture. So we do provide pretty strong tooling support for Java developers, specifically Java developers on Azure. So we support basically all of the popular DevOps tools. So Maven, Jenkins, Terraform, GitHub Actions, all of these have, if you notice, they will have Azure and Java tie-ins, at the bare minimum being allowing you to deploy your Java applications onto each of these respective platforms using the Java language, or even being able to monitor them in some cases. Now, the most interesting thing that I'd like to talk about here is the Azure SDK. So let's assume for a second that you're not using Maven, or we also support Gradle, by the way. So let's suppose you're not using any of those and you're doing old school Maven or old school Ant, or you're not using a build system at all. Or you happen to be a infrastructure provider yourself that needs to integrate into Azure. The way you do that is something called the Azure SDK. And basically the Azure SDK is the key to the kingdom in terms of being able to do any kind of resource management on Azure that we want. This Azure SDK, which is the lowest level sort of power tools access into the Azure platform, that actually has a Java binding as well. So even that work you could write in Java if you so wish. I think that really tells you, just how much effort is being put into building out Java support for certainly in terms of Azure. Okay. Now, beyond Azure, we do provide some plugins for Azure in terms of the popular IDEs, things like IntelliJ and Eclipse. But I hope you also know that we provide our own IDE for Java developers as well, and that is VSCode for Java, right? So VSCode actually has strong support for Java. You can, most of the basic things that you would do as a Java developers, more or less you can do with VS Code. So this includes things like debugging, Maven integration, JUnit integration, support for Spring, Java E, Jakarta E, micro-profile runtimes, and of course, support for Azure as well. So if you happen to be in the market for a development tool, you should check out VSCode for Java and see what you think of it. All right, so I'm now going to dive into a little bit into solution samples, just to tie everything together. I covered quite a bit of ground. I want to give you more concrete examples, and these examples are actually somewhat inspired by actual deployments that I've worked on Azure with customers. But before I do that, again, let me stop a little bit and give you a chance to ask any questions that you would like. Okay, all right, let's move forward. So here's a few solution samples that are representative of the types of workloads that, or the flavors of workloads that we support on Azure. So let's assume for a second that you're using WebLogic Server and you're going to deploy WebLogic Server onto Azure virtual machines. You can do that using our Marketplace solution template. It has baked-in support for things like App Gateway. It has baked-in support for Oracle coherence if you want a cache behind your WebLogic Server clusters. It also has built-in support for database integration. So let's assume you want to run Oracle database on virtual machines on Azure. You can do that. And you could even integrate with a managed version of Elastic running on Azure. All of this deployment you could do through Maven because we provide support for Maven. And that could be coming from Jenkins that is also running on Azure virtual machines. And that could be pushed from GitHub, and you could be using Eclipse as your IDE. Similarly, let's assume that you're using Azure Kubernetes Service. Again, we provide step-by-step guidance on how to use things like OpenLiberty or Web Liberty on the Azure Kubernetes Service. So once you do that, again, you can integrate with all of the rest of the Azure services that are out there in terms of App Insights for monitoring or Active Directory for security. Again, App Gateway as your load balancing solution in front of the Azure Kubernetes Service. In fact, Azure Kubernetes Service sort of provides native support for App Gateway. You could be talking to all kinds of databases where it's NoSQL or just relational database or sort of key value caching mechanisms with Redis. In fact, Liberty has a very interesting capability where it can use Redis as its session cache, its internal session cache. You could be again doing the deployment in Azure Container Registry, typically through the Azure Container Registry for most enterprises, and that has excellent tie-ins with GitHub Actions to very easily be able to publish into the Azure Container Registry. And again, you could be doing using GitHub as your repository and perhaps doing IntelliJ for your development. Again, we have excellent support for Azure built into the Eclipse, built into the IntelliJ IDE via the plugins that we developed. For JBoss developers, very simple, right? So again, if you could be using App Service as your managed runtime, again using Maven, Jenkins, GitHub, IntelliJ. Doing all of the rest of those integrations that you would like. And many of those integrations are actually baked into App Service as well. So for example, things like Key Vault and Active Directory. Spring applications, it's the Spring Cloud Service is sort of a one-stop shop for Spring Spring Cloud native developers. You could be basically deploying a bunch of Spring Boot jars, as many as you want, and then consuming those managed services that are there as baked into part of the Spring Cloud service, whether that's distributed tracing or service registry or what have you, and then consuming the rest of the Azure ecosystem in terms of services as well as DevOps tools and so on. This is a very interesting one, and this is actually inspired by one of the key customers that we have using Java on our functions platform. So VSCode actually enables you to just deploy your, often when you're doing services development, you're not doing things like repositories and the like, right? So often it's very, very lean and very straightforward development. So that VSCode recognizes that. And in fact, we even have tool chains for IntelliJ that will do this as well, is that you can deploy your Azure functions directly from VSCode. Let's say you have a number of different functions all monitoring a blob storage, a file storage. Somebody is doing a file upload, and then logic apps will, depending on, let's say, the file type or file markers, will route to a particular Azure function written in Java, and that Azure function will have bindings to talk to the rest of the Azure platform, whether it's Cosmos DB, storing an entry in the Cosmos DB, or entering a message into the Azure Service Bus that can be consumed by JMS later on, or sending like an SMS via Twilio. So all of that is also possible, and definitely people are doing these sorts of things on the Azure platform. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. That's my 10-minute notification there. Okay. So if you have not used Azure before and you don't really have an idea of how it looks like, here's a way you can get started really easily. So I'll do a quick demo of this, but this is something that I developed actually mostly for fun. It is on my personal GitHub repository. It's something called Azure Cafe. I'm a Java EE guy. That shouldn't be a surprise to most people. So this is a Java EE application, but really this application could be a Spring Boot application or what have you. But once you log on into this repository, it will give you a first-hand example of how it is like, what the development experience is like for a Java developer on the Azure platform. So let me show you a bit of that about how this repository looks like. So let me pull up my my GitHub account. So there it is. And the link is embedded within the slide deck. Slide deck is available on the JCon site. And also, if you reach out to me, I can give you the slide deck version as well if you prefer. So this is the application. It's a Java EE application. It is using JDK 11. In this example, I use VSCode for my IDE. I'll show you the things running on VSCode. Wildfly is the runtime that I chose. In this case, I'm actually using Azure Kubernetes service. Right? So this is I'm deploying onto Kubernetes using managed PostgreSQL or managed PostgreSQL PaaS. Using application insights, which I'll show you a demo of also. So this is a sort of Azure native equivalent of ELK, if you will. I'm also using Azure Redis cache, in this case as a second level cache in my JPA layer. So you can follow these steps. We'll go through the setup with a free account on Azure. You can run the application locally. I'll show you the application running. And you can also deploy the application and see how the application looks like from the cloud if you haven't done that before. So let me show you the application real quick. The application isn't anything to be too excited about. It's a relatively simple CRUD application. So I'll open up VS Code, and here you go. So in VS Code, I'll just say start the server. I'm starting Wildfly from VS Code. And I believe it's almost done. Let me see here. The machine is a little bit slow, of course. It always has to be the case when you're doing demos. Okay, that's fine. All right, you clear the output. I think the application is up and running now. Pull this down a bit. Okay, there's Wildfly running locally. I'll just say Azure Cafe. And again, it's a pretty simple application. It's a CRUD application. I'll just do a delete here for you. And let me recreate another record. And there you have it. Okay, so let me shut it down. I think this alone is interesting. So this is actually a fully fledged environment. You can very easily do Java EE development using VS Code. It's really no problem at all. So I have deployed this application on the cloud as well. I'll show you the deployment. So here's the Azure portal if you have not seen it before. Here's a resource group that I created for the application. There's a number of elements in here. Let me see if you can, I hope you can see it. It's a little bit hard to see, but let me see if I can maybe increase the font. Or that, yeah, that may help. Okay. Oh, that doesn't help. Let me do 90%. Hopefully you can see it. So here's the Azure. I have an instance of Azure Cache, Azure Redis Cache running here. I'll show you that. I'll go into it and I'll show you what is going on there in a moment. Here's the Kubernetes cluster that is up and running. It's a managed cluster. So if I take a look at the activity log or the insights, you'll see that there's some things that are deploying and there's some activity. This is a nice little dashboard that you can use with Azure Kubernetes Service. There's insights. We'll start, and this is the database. So this is the instance of the managed database that is running, and as you can see, there is some activity there also. Let's go into the insights real quick. And in the insights, I'll go into the log panel. And let me pull up the traces. And run it. I can run a more complex query if I wanted to. I'm just keeping it very simple. Remote one traces. Thank you. Okay, so this is all of my log entries. So what's happening is the application, I actually have configured the application to dump out the logs into App Insights. So just like in a production environment, you can take a look at all of the log entries that this application has produced. So there should be a delete in here, a delete message in here that I just used to delete my entry. Maybe it's not refreshed quite yet. Okay, so aside from app Insights, let me also show you the cache. Okay, so going up here, we have here's the Azure Cache, and if you look in the insights for this, you'll see that there's some cache activity. Okay, so what's happening is this is a Java EE application that is using Redis. When you look into the code, you'll see it. I've configured it to be dumping out the JPA second level cache into Azure Redis. So this is all of the cache hits that, as you can see. So let me show you the application running on the cloud real quick. Okay, so these are the pods. There's a couple of pods that are running. Okay, so as you can see, they're both ready. Let me get the services just in case I messed with it. Okay, so here's the external IP address. Let me copy that, paste it onto the browser. And there's Wildfly running. I hit one of the pods. And if I go to the Azure Cafe, we should be able to see the same data because locally I was still connecting to the Azure Postgres instance running. Okay, so there you have it. Feel free to take a look at it. It should give you at least a decent feel for how it is like to be a Java developer on Azure and what the experience is, what the experience should be. Okay. All right, so I have a quick question here. Let me try to finish up and then I will try to answer this question. Okay. All right. So Microsoft is pretty serious about Java. Hopefully this gives you a flavor for what it is. Frankly speaking, I think of all the major cloud developers, we are probably doing more for Java developers than I think, frankly, anybody else. Hopefully it's self-evident in the presentation that I just had. Whatever your pathway, whatever application, whatever flavor application you have, beginning from tooling to getting our JDK in place and to Azure in particular, you should have a very strong solution set that you can use. So here are some links that are pertinent to Java on Azure. You can take a look at them. They're in the slide deck, similar to my GitHub repo. It should give you a good idea of what's what. Okay, so that's about it in the presentation. Let me get into the chat and feel free to post any questions. I'm almost out of time. I believe I only have about a minute or so. So apologies for that, but if you do have questions, do post them now, please. Otherwise, I'll share my contact information as well. You could always contact me later. Is it possible to have separated environments of the same application? One for production, one for development, maybe one for pre-production. How is it going to live done when an environment consists of many components? So typically you would do this through Azure resource groups. You can create a particular Azure resource group per type of environment that you have. In fact, a lot of these environments ultimately is created through ARM templates. You can even use something like Terraform to do each of these deployments that correspond to essentially a resource group. So you could have resource group prod, resource group QA, resource group dev, and so on and so forth. And you can even script the creation of these environments by, again, using something like ARM or Terraform. So that's typically what our customers wind up doing in terms of separating environments. Okay, yeah, thank you, Mirko, for answering that question on my behalf. Let me, before we're completely out of time, I'm going to share with you my contact information. Or if you just, if I do run out of time, just feel free to take a look at it in your chat. And I just cleared my cache not too long ago, and hence I don't have access to my own website, or I can find it real quick, that is. Okay, so here's my contact page. So feel free to contact me. This has all of my information. And everyone in the meeting, here is my contact info. Okay, and that's about it. Again, the slides are on the JCon website. You should also be able to find it on Speaker Deck. I really appreciate your time. I hope this was useful, and I'll see you sometime soon, maybe in another conference or in a workshop.